So welcome everyone to Office Hours. This is the root cause analysis interview with Leslie Chen. I'm your host, Ryan George. I work at Lyft. I do analytics and also mentor here on Springboard. But we're very lucky to have Leslie here tonight. She does international growth at Square and has a lot of great stories and is going to tell us more about the root cause analysis case. So without further ado, Leslie, if you want to tell us a little bit more about your background, what brought you into analytics, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I went to UC Berkeley, studied business administration there. And after I graduated, I worked in management consulting at Deloitte for 3 years. And during my time there, I dabbled in a bunch of different projects, but they all kind of centered around pulling insights from data and using that data in a way that could inform business decisions. So that was kind of the underlying thread across a lot of my projects, which spanned pretty much every industry. And so after that, I realized that that's something that, I had a pretty strong skill set in, and I started to look for other opportunities, more specifically in technology and financial services. And so that's where I found a really great role at Square, basically applying data analytics to inform our international growth strategy. And so that's what I'm doing now. So a lot of the tools that I've been using over the past 4 years are Excel, Tableau, SQL, basically all the tools that are being taught in this course. So it's really exciting to be a part of this as a mentor and also as a case writer.
Excellent. Yeah, and we're glad to have you. So hopefully we'll pull on a little bit of that experience as we're talking about the case as well. So I wanted to ask, just as a brief introduction, kind of what is the, let's talk about the so what, right? For everything we do in this course, there's a so what, so I can make this graph, so what. So what's the so what of root cause analysis? What's the real life problem that it solves?
Yeah, so root cause analysis is a very kind of reactive methodology in terms of business cases and the different types of approaches you can take to solve problems. So typically, some sort of problem or symptom arises. And so if you've read through the case document, the example used is, airline delays as kind of a problem and seeing a surge there. And a lot of times when businesses identify these problems, you're really trying to define an approach to how to solve that problem. And part of it is kind of a diagnosis, like where is this problem actually coming from? What's the quote unquote root cause? And the reason why it's important to correctly identify the root cause is because when you're trying to troubleshoot, when you're trying to correct the issue, if you don't identify the correct root cause and you end up, trying to fix something else, you're not actually going to be making improvements. You're not actually going to solve the problem. So that's why developing a very robust approach to identifying that root cause is really important. And so a lot of times the data can be misleading because it'll show something kind of more as a surface level symptom, and you might misinterpret that as a root cause and then eventually try to correct that through your recommendation, but that might not actually address the underlying problem. So again, it's a very reactive approach, but it's a critical one because at the end of the day, if you're not correctly identifying a solution to the right problem, then you're never really going to solve it.
So real quick, before we jump into the actual case, do you have an example of maybe when you've used this type of thinking at Square, Deloitte, or elsewhere?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been looking at a lot at Square, for instance, is profitability. And that's a pretty common question in a lot of businesses, just like monitoring profitability and seeing, ideally you want your profitability to improve over time. So typically, something that could come up is, profitability is in decline or stagnant, and you're trying to identify what's the core issue there. And so with profitability, it's a very basic equation of revenue minus cost. And so you kind of evaluate both of those two parts of the equation to eventually isolate your root cause. So looking on the revenue side, did prices go down or did your quantity go down? Those could each be underlying factors. And then you can dig in further by product, by your actual product mix that you're selling. So those could all be potential reasons for that on the revenue side. Then you can also look at the cost side and say, okay, well, maybe profitability is going down because costs are going up. Well, are costs going up in terms of fixed costs or in terms of variable costs, which are kind of a per unit cost that you incur with every unit that you produce. So that's where you can kind of like take the different parts of your equation, break it down, and then dig further as you identify, as you start to isolate the problem into specific areas of the business. So that's kind of a very common problem that comes up.
Yeah, it comes up quite a bit at Lyft as well. Numbers are up, numbers are down. Why are they up? Why are they down?
Yeah.
So let's jump into the case a little bit. Can you tell us just, brief overview of the case in case, students who are watching this later haven't seen it before, and then what do you really hope at a high level students take from this case?
Yeah, so this case is basically looking at like an e-commerce company that has experienced a surge in return rates. And you're basically trying to dig into why is that the case and potentially isolate that to very specific product groups. And so a lot of the challenge, I think, for some people when they're approaching a root cause analysis is wanting to dig into the data right away and trying to like play with it and hope that eventually you'll come across something that can give you a clear answer. And that can work on some occasions when you're lucky, but as mentioned earlier, one of the key ways to actually identifying a root cause is the logic behind how you come to that conclusion and the logic behind how you analyze your data, which can help make sure that you robustly eliminate any other potential reasons or variables. So with the data, one of the big things to keep in mind is start with charting out the approach. And in this particular case, there's kind of a guideline that's provided around, which of the hypotheses you want to verify, and then also what the kind of sequence of those hypotheses are. But ideally, if you want to give yourself a challenge, try to draft your own hypotheses, read the case first, think about how you would approach this if this were really a case that you were on, and figure out a way to support that with the data. So yeah, that's basically the overall kind of objective of the case. And kind of as you're digging through the data, it's easy to just kind of go through each hypothesis and check the box and say, okay, this one's true, this one's false. But beyond that, what you want to do is with each insight that you get, with every hypothesis that you verify, you want to dig in further and build off those insights. So, if hypothesis 1 is proven true, well, then give yourself some of those, those 5 why questions to dig a little further. And I think that will actually help with your overall kind of grasp of the data and understanding of the actual root cause.
Yeah, excellent. So I wanted to take a break real quick to say to the students that joined us, please, this is a two-way discussion. This is your chance to talk with the case creator and really also hear about Leslie's experience at Square. And so please chime in with any questions via chat. Thanks for the Merry Christmas, Mara. Or Happy New Year. That's wonderful. Please chime in with questions over chat or via audio. Love to make this a two-way conversation. So one of the questions, Leslie, we have a number of hypotheses outlined in the case itself. Do you recommend as part of this exercise that students should outline a few more hypotheses, or mainly think about trying to prove or disprove the ones that are on the case?
Yeah, so we start out with kind of 3 core hypotheses and there's sub-hypotheses, but beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, you want to, with each insight, kind of dig a little further. So while the guideline is provided around what hypotheses you want to prove and disprove, if you really want to get to the right answer, you're going to have to dig a little further, just a little further. So I think it's good to, it's a good exercise of, okay, you know, applying a guideline, but then getting yourself to make that extra effort of like really digging into the data and seeing what's available there. And what you'll also notice is that, you know, not all the data provided is actually necessary to go through the hypotheses. So if you want to, you can dig into the other data as well that you haven't really touched, if that's of interest to you as well.
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, one of the questions that we had is around kind of visualizations. A lot of the curriculum is in terms of visualization, you know, in sort of the week leading up to root cause. And so it'd be interesting to think about, you know, are there any visualizations or type of visualizations that you would recommend as, you know, in general part of the root cause analysis approach, or like specifically for this data?
Yeah, I think generally with root cause, the reason why visualization works really well for that is because it helps kind of isolate and communicate where the problems might be. Mm-hmm. And so that's where, you know, things like bar charts are really helpful. Eventually, when we get into Tableau, that's actually a really great tool for root cause analysis as well, where you can use kind of iterative methods in digging into the data pretty quickly. So that also makes root cause analysis much more thorough and much more kind of interactive and engaging. Mm-hmm. Another thing with root cause analysis, though, is kind of as you're going through the data, you're also digging into deeper and deeper levels of the data. So, for example, with the current case, you know, you have your kind of main product categories, but then you also have your specific product names and then also your specific product IDs, right? So as you're digging into each of those levels, you know, visualization will apply more at some levels and not the others. Mm-hmm. So that's where you kind of want to think a little bit about what's the best way to present that data in a way that's not too overwhelming, but that's going to help isolate the core or root problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So while we're at it, let's talk a little bit about the data model. I'm not sure if you have it in front of you, but I guess in past versions, students have had questions around just kind of what are the different tables, what do they mean, why are there multiple tables? So sorry if I'm springing this on you a little bit, but could you chat through maybe just the types of data, the details that students have, again, just in case students haven't looked through it, or the tables in the case didn't totally make sense?
Yeah, let me try to open that first. Yeah, so originally, I think the version of the data now has combined the return table with the sales data. Mm-hmm. So that hopefully will make it easier for some people who are trying to combine the two tables. But basically, you have your sales data in that first tab. Mm-hmm. And in the sales data, this is basically a very generic set of transaction data where you have your order IDs, your super categories, your categories of products, and then your product IDs. So these are kind of all identifiers, but they basically link every product ID into these categories. Mm-hmm. Which, again, as you look through the hypothesis or the approach for root cause analysis, you want to start at the super category level and then dig further into product ID. So you don't want to jump right into product ID just yet. And then the other important factors are the time, the timestamps around what week the order was made and the actual date, mm-hmm. the price, and then the return code. So for the return code, if it is blank, then that means the product wasn't returned. Mm-hmm. If there is a return code, that then maps to a return reason in the second table, in the second tab. So this kind of is a reference for, you know, if you see RT07, then that means that a product was returned because of missing parts or accessories. Mm-hmm. And then the third tab is basically a list of stockout days by product ID by date.
Mm-hmm.
So table 2 is basically a summary of table 1. So depending on how you want to dig into the data, you might prefer table 2 instead, where it's summarized by product ID, versus table 1, which literally lists every product ID and by every day. So, PRD 100, for instance, will show up, 30 times or something for every day.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on which view you prefer, there's kind of two options there.
Okay, great. So just to summarize, table 2 in the third tab is basically a pivot table or a summary of table 1.
Yeah.
So if you can actually create table 2 from table 1.
Yeah.
For anyone that's looking into it now. Excellent. So I guess one of the questions just in general is kind of what is the advice you have for students that have looked through the material as they're approaching the case? What are some of the pitfalls, and how could students kind of go above and beyond just the listed questions and maybe make the work their own a little bit?
Yeah, so the general pitfalls is, again, where students want to jump into the data right away and hope that they can kind of solve it just by, looking at the data in different ways and splicing it. And again, like a big part of this case is understanding the logic behind how to do root cause analysis, and learning to start from the high level with these hypotheses, proving, disproving, using the data, and then digging further. So I would definitely make sure you fully understand the hypotheses first, and then fully understand what data you have available, and be able to kind of piece that together in your mind before you even start, analyzing the data itself. But I'd say that's like the number one thing that tends to happen with this type of case. Another problem too is sometimes people get caught up with trying to prove a hypothesis and get frustrated when the data doesn't really show that. So a lot of times, it's very easy to go down a rabbit hole and kind of get stuck there, and kind of forget that there's all these other hypotheses and potential approaches, or kind of potential questions that you want to be answering. Yeah. So I would say when you realize that, hypothesis 1, for instance, is false, then move on and try to and dig into hypothesis 2 and try to get kind of a good understanding of those 3 hypotheses before you're kind of digging yourself into the lower level details.
For sure. So I wanted to pause here and give the students that are here a chance to ask any questions. This is a really good opportunity to hear more about the case, if you've looked into it, or just root cause analysis in general, or international growth and square. Let's see if we have any questions. You can always enter them in via chat as well.
I think another thing I'll add to answer the other part to your question was around, going above and beyond and trying to really own this case. And I think students can really do that by trying to draft their own set of hypotheses before, taking the guideline as given. So really question it. Like the hypotheses listed there are by no means a right answer. So if you think about it and, you want to take a different approach, definitely feel free to do that. And a big part of doing this type of exercise as well is having that approach and understanding the logic behind the problem solving. So, as you're going through the data and as you're pulling out, as you're writing your conclusions, be sure to also note your approach, any notes you have around anything interesting you've observed as you've dug into that hypothesis that you might want to dig into later. So documenting all of that in your answers as well is really great for even just your mentors to understand your thought process. And then also for you later to troubleshoot when you kind of go to the end and realize you're stuck and, you miss something along the way, you can go back and pretty quickly review the logic that you took. So that's the only other piece of advice I would give.
Excellent. Yeah, and just speaking from kind of like, having seen other cases and have seen some students go through similar cases, the curriculum in many ways is structured such that there's more guidance at the beginning of the course and less at the end in the cases. And so whereas, in the first case, in terms of forecasting and Chiboodle, like the slides and the presentation is all given to you here, it's really not, and it's really also up to the student, like how they want to present the results and how they want to communicate these findings, whether in Excel or in a PowerPoint presentation or in a document of some form. That's another space where I think you gain some extra latitude between case one and this case.
Exactly.
Yeah. So one of the things that I chatting with a student about is sort of the difference between root cause analysis, trying to figure out kind of like what happened, and maybe something like establishing a causal relationship, like a lot of product analytics will do, like doing A/B testing and trying to discover kind of like principles of user behavior. Can you speak to the difference between that, sort of what root cause analysis is? Because I think there's sometimes a confusion around the word cause.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned earlier, the root cause analysis is typically a very reactive approach to solving a problem. So, it starts with a symptom, like some sort of issue like airline delays, and then you kind of want to figure out how to correct that or change that or eliminate it. And so that's where you kind of take the root cause analysis approach of identifying what's really causing that issue. Whereas for some of the other types of causal problems or establishing causal relationships, those are more starting with the causes and trying to create an effect. So it's almost like the inverse, I would say. It's a similar idea, though.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So we have an excellent question from Mario, who asks, sort of in a little bit of a different vein, kind of at the end of the process in business decision making, how much weight have you seen, at Square and elsewhere, put on the data-driven recommendations versus the non-quantified factors, the intuition, the experience?
Yeah, so I think that really depends on how much data is available and is being collected by the company. I think for a lot of companies now, especially technology companies, there's a lot of data being collected on customers, users, and so that because that data is available, there's a greater emphasis being put on data-driven recommendations and really kind of trying to prove something before you implement necessarily. So I would say it's definitely more of an emphasis on that. I think where intuition is helpful is for kind of those kind of day-to-day quick decisions that have to be made about kind of lower level, lower impact activities where you don't want to put that much investment, but eventually, like a lot of those operations eventually become supported by data because you build things like dashboards, you build things like self-service data tools so that you can inform those decisions more readily. Yeah.
And I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of the intuition that like a business leader will have is actually built on data that they've seen previously.
Exactly.
So it sort of builds on itself, but really good question, Mario. Thank you for that. One last call for questions. We only have a couple minutes left before we ask Leslie for her final closing words and thoughts. So, I think maybe in closing, we can address Mario's last question, maybe drawing on your experience again. How do students know when to use root cause analysis? Or, this is now a tool the students, after doing this case will have in their belt. But how do you sort of recognize, okay, this would be an ideal time to use this mode of thinking?
Yeah, so that really depends on like what data you have available and whether you're trying to solve a problem where you identified like a symptom that is measurable. So, for example, like, with airline delays or with, return rates, those are things that you're tracking and you have data behind. So you can use root cause analysis to diagnose those types of problems. But say, for example, there's a problem around like bad brand awareness and perception or sentiment, right? And you're not tracking that readily and you don't have any data. You can't really use root cause because you don't have any data to support or help verify any of your hypotheses. So that's really going to require a different type of approach. Or it might mean that you have to fill in those data pieces, right? You might have to conduct a survey or something to get some data, both past and current, so that you have something to compare. So those are things where you can make it a root cause problem if you have means and ways of gathering the data.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Any other final thoughts before we let you go? Leslie, any other final thoughts? This has been great chatting with you.
Yeah. Well, so I think this case overall isn't too difficult compared to a lot of the other ones, especially because there is sort of a guidance around it, and there's not the data itself isn't too difficult to dig into. I think one of the main tools you'll end up using is pivot tables to splice and dice your data. What I would say as well, though, is eventually, as we introduce other tools like Tableau, SQL, you'll look back on this case and be like, hey, I can do it, using these other tools, and I can, maybe do it faster using these other tools. So that's where, it'll be a good one to keep in the back of your mind as you're going through this course, because, you'll find new ways and better ways of solving it.
Excellent. Sounds great. Thank you so much for joining us, Leslie. This has been great to hear from you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great session. Thanks for joining us, all the students, and we'll see you next week. All right.
Bye.
Bye.